Hello, my name is Jeremy Davis, and on behalf of myself and Duncan Purves, I want to thank you for tuning into this talk. Our talk explores the intersection of institutional trust and algorithms through the lens of philosophical ethics. We'll have some policy recommendations at the end, but the bulk of our talk today will seek to show how the use of AI in criminal justice tends to give rise to a kind of opacity that threatens public trust and the legitimacy of these institutions. So to begin, let's consider the case, which many of you are no doubt familiar with, of Eric Loomis. Loomis played a relatively minor role in a drive-by shooting in 2013 in Wisconsin. During his sentencing, the court used the Compass risk assessment algorithm to determine his risk of reoffending. The software is used in a number of jurisdictions across the country and is both developed and maintained by a private company called Equivant, formerly known as Northpoint. In Loomis's case, Compass deemed him a high risk of reoffending, and so the judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison. Now, when Loomis appealed his sentence on the grounds that Compass's methodology was a trade secret and thus they were using it without granting access to the algorithm itself, he argued that this denied him his right to due process. Now, unfortunately for Loomis, the Wisconsin Supreme Court did not agree with him and decided to uphold his sentence. The case of Eric Loomis is one of many instances in which the use of opaque opaque algorithms in criminal justice contexts generates a form of injustice. Most of you are probably familiar with other technologies used in criminal justice, like PredPol. There's a picture of that on the left part of the screen here, which is used in a number of police departments across the country, or programs like it, and relies on arrest data and other forms of police data to determine when and where future crime is likely to occur, so that officers can be placed in those hotspots. And over on the right is an image from the Compass software we just spoke about. Our focus in this talk is on these and other AI-based technologies that are used in police departments and courthouses throughout the country. So I've mentioned it already, the idea that algorithms can be opaque, but it's worth being a little bit more precise about that idea. On our view, an algorithm is opaque to some degree just in case the contribution of any single feature of the world to the final prediction, whether the subject of the prediction is an individual or a place, cannot be easily understood either by the human decision maker or by persons affected by the prediction. So it's often remarked that opacity of the kind that we're talking about here masks unfair treatment, especially biased or racist treatment. This is a common view of, for example, predictive policing. If you haven't seen it already, there's a very detailed ProPublica story that outlines this argument. Others argue that the issue with opacity of these algorithms is that it threatens public accountability. Now, we accept both of these claims in some form, but those aren't our focus today. Our focus today is offering another argument against opaque algorithms. In particular, our view is that algorithmic opacity is problematic because, and to the extent that, it threatens the trustworthiness of criminal justice institutions, which in turn threatens their legitimacy. So in the remainder of this short talk, we're going to outline what we mean by trustworthiness, the different types of opacity, how opacity threatens trustworthiness, and how it threatens legitimacy, before closing with some policy recommendations. So first, our account of trustworthiness is adapted from the account offered by Karen Jones in her paper, Trustworthiness from 2012. On her account, trustworthiness is a function of the individual's competence, and they're taking the fact of being counted on as a compelling reason for acting as counting on. Jones's account is intended as an account of interpersonal trustworthiness, but of course we're discussing institutional trustworthiness. And when we think of the people we trust most, they seem to be people who are competent to do what we count on them to do, and they seem to be motivated by what we count on them to do, by the fact that we're counting on them. And the same, we argue, goes for institutions. So in other words, we think that the kind of account of interpersonal trustworthiness can be adapted in this way to institutions. But the shift to institutional trust will require some modifications to Jones's account. In particular, while we think that the competence condition remains roughly as it is, the motivational condition should be refigured somewhat. In particular, institutions should be what we refer to as non-accidentally responsive to the fact that they're being counted on. This means, among other things, ensuring that there are mechanisms and systems in place so that misconduct and other threats to trust are handled within the institution in appropriate ways. Furthermore, institutional trust requires signaling. That is, that the institution aims to demonstrate its trustworthiness to those subject to it. One could imagine this being a condition on interpersonal trust as well, but it's certainly essential in institutional contexts. We need institutions, particularly those with various forms of authority, to demonstrate their trustworthiness through publicity and promotion of the aforementioned features. Since without them, the institutions may be otherwise trustworthy, but those subject to their authority will be incapable of meaningfully trusting them. So we've spoken a bit already about opacity as it relates to AI and criminal justice context, but we find 4 distinctive types of opacity in this sort of domain. Now, we don't claim that this is an exhaustive list, nor that each of these is fully separate from the others. We think there's overlap and perhaps other forms of opacity that are important as well. The first is what we call proprietary opacity. As we noted in the Eric Loomis case we discussed earlier, certain algorithms at use in criminal justice contexts are proprietary. That is, their code is secret and cannot be accessed by those subject to it. Second is technical opacity. Technical opacity concerns the fact that even if these algorithms were accessible, available to most people, they would not be able to understand them. Most people would not be able to understand them because doing so requires specialized knowledge that very few people possess. Next, a deeper sort of technical opacity is what we call fundamental opacity. That is, even those who do possess the relevant relevant expertise in programming languages and statistical optimization methods could not understand the more complex algorithms at use in certain cases. This is just because of the level of detail that goes into some of the more refined and sophisticated algorithms that are either at use now or will soon be at use in the future. There is therefore a much deeper sort of opacity that no single person or perhaps even a team of people could render sufficiently transparent. Finally, there is implementation opacity. Many algorithmic systems are shrouded in secrecy or insufficiently public in terms of the extent of their implementation. Sometimes this opacity is by design. If too many knew the details of their use, they would be rendered ineffective. But other cases seem to involve incentives or perceived incentives for avoiding scrutiny or public knowledge of the extent of their implementation. All the kinds of opacity we just discussed call into question the competence condition for trustworthiness we mentioned earlier. In particular, the fact that individuals cannot access the algorithms, and even if they could, they cannot understand the basis for their treatment, casts doubt on the ability of the criminal justice institutions to carry out their mandate in a competent way. You can consider here a case from Sarah Brain's recent book, Predict and Surveil, in which an LAPD police captain said that the predictive technology their department used, quote, involves a mathematical equation I know nothing about, end quote. That certainly calls into question the ability for those departments to demonstrate their competence in their relevant domain. Furthermore, proprietary and implementation opacity call into question the ability of criminal justice institutions to clearly signal their trustworthiness. That is, if institutions cannot or will not inform the public of the details of their treatment, then their ability, the institution's ability to signal their trustworthiness is eroded, and so too is their overall trustworthiness. Beyond its effects on trustworthiness, we also find that opacity threatens an institution's legitimacy. There are 2 kinds of legitimacy one might appeal to here. The first, descriptive legitimacy, is a familiar idea to those working in the social science literature on this question. Tyler and Huo write that legitimacy is, quote, the belief that authorities, institutions, and social arrangements are appropriate, proper, and just, end quote. In other words, legitimacy is determined by the beliefs or attitudes of those subject to an apparent authority. All of the forms of opacity discussed above threaten this form of legitimacy. When institutions employ opaque methods, individuals will be less compliant and will call upon institutions for help less when doing so would otherwise be helpful. This threatens to create a sort of feedback loop in which compliance and help-seeking behavior is further eroded, and in turn, the institution's ability to maintain competence in its domain is threatened. Opacity also threatens an institution's normative legitimacy. And this is the idea that institutions claim a sort of legitimacy which stands in need of a justification. One can think here of social contract thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, both of whom appeal implicitly and explicitly to trust as a condition on normative legitimacy. Now, there's plenty more to say about that, and we can't get into all the finer details here, but hopefully you get a sense of what each sort of legitimacy means in this context. So I want to close out with a few brief policy recommendations, which of course require a lot more to fully flesh out, but just to give a sense of where we think the institution should go from here. And we think that some of these recommendations will alleviate some of the concerns that we've raised here. So first, courts and police departments using algorithms ought to allow for algorithmic auditing. This would help eliminate certain forms of opacity and would enable those institutions to better signal their competence. We also need to rethink private property rights for public technologies. Perhaps when such systems are used in police departments or courts, the intellectual property rights of their developers ought to be significantly curtailed for the public good. And there was this past week a court case in New Jersey that made some progress on this point as well. We also need to reconsider the way we police. This includes approaching the work of policing differently, as well as creating better accountability measures like police advisory councils. Finally, opacity is greatly reduced when institutions are held accountable by the media. A recent scandal involving the involving the use of algorithmic policing systems by the Pasco County Sheriff's Department in Tampa, Florida, has dragged on for several months, in large part due to the lack of cooperation in the reporting by the Sheriff's Office. So we'll close there. Thank you again for your time and for taking the time to be with us today. We look forward to your questions and discussion. And if we can't get to it today, please do shoot us an email. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Thanks so much.